Welcome to another episode 43 of the Real Thomas Jefferson. The aim of this show is to get real about Thomas Jefferson, clarity through critical analysis of Jefferson's writings and the writings of Jeffersonian scholars. We aim to revisit and revise the revisionists in the business of deconstructing Jefferson's prose, including his letters, addresses, and memos. Nearly all Jeffersonian biographers today take it upon themselves to write of Jefferson's two-facedness. What Jefferson says most often cannot be understood literally. His prose must be deconstructed, and so intuitiveness and knack are needed in preference to logical acumen. It is commonplace to call the man a hypocrite, a racist, and even a contradiction. And those epithets are typically cast from the perspective of today's Moors. This show then aims to dispel that myth. Jefferson can be known, and logic, not intuitive and discretionary deconstruction, is the method. I'm Dr. Richard Bilato, and this is The Real Thomas Jefferson, episode number 43. Today we follow up on our last show when we evaluated a paper on Jefferson's avowed racism by Paul Finkelman. In this episode, we tackle a particular comment by Jefferson about the natural propinquity of blacks and orangutans. This show then centers on the one sentence in an effort for scholarly clarity.
So we're going to do one sentence, a whole show on one sentence. That's pretty.
I love it.
Yeah, I do too. It's kind of a weird thing. I don't think I've ever done that. We've ever done that before. So let's, I like that word propinquity too, by the way. It's just got a nice sound. It's got the p and then the q-u, propinquity. Good word. I like that. I'll pass on. Anyways, all right. We're going into Notes on Virginia, query 14. That's where the quote is. Are you ready?
I are ready.
You are ready. You is ready.
Question number 1. Okay, let's get to the passage. Jefferson writes, flowing hair, a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of whites, declared by their preference of them as uniformly as is the preference for the orangutan for the black women of those of his own species. This is a strange sentence. Can you give us this sentence in its context of query 14?
Yeah, it is a strange sentence. And query 14 is titled Laws. And I think, if I remember correctly, it's the longest query that Jefferson has in the book. And he covers a multiplicity of things. It might be query 6 is longer, I'm not sure. But he goes into the nature of blacks for some reason. And, you wonder if, and he's talking about the political, the physical, the moral attributes of blacks. And he talks about Native Americans as well. And, in my book on Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which is a critical analysis, I wonder if this might be better placed somewhere else, but I don't know where else you might place it. But anyways, he's talking about, black skin color, which he finds the dark color he thinks is less beautiful. I'm looking at his Notes on Virginia here, the wonderful William Peden 1954 edition. And he says the whites have flowing hair, which is more elegant. And that goes into the notion of beauty and sublimity that's been studied for the first time. The notion of winding curves is very beautiful, according to many of the people of the day. The people are studying beauty for the first time in the way you might study biology. So whites they don't have the crinkly, curly hair, they have flowing hair. And he says, their own judgment in favor of the whites. And here he's talking about black people preferring whites, finding them more attractive, declared by the preference of them as uniformly as the preference of the orangutan for the black women over those of his own species. Now, what he's saying here is that black women prefer white males and orangutans prefer black women and so forth. And it sounds prima facie, like a really stupid claim. Okay, and people have said that. We'll talk about that. So within the context, what Jefferson is talking about, we'll get into the context, the scientific context, but it comes into a whole long passage on Jefferson talking about the physical characteristics of Black people, their secretions, their sleep needs, their bravado, their sexual ardency, their grieving. So he's studying all aspects of Black people. And I just want to add one thing, his assessment is both by his personal experiences as well as study of other people, studying human beings for the first time and different people. But he says, in the laws, he's a pure empiricist, meaning he's gathering up data, he's looking at scientific literature, he's using his own observations of others. But he says the opinion that they are inferior in the faculties of reason and imagination, which he asserts, must be hazarded with great diffidence. To justify a general conclusion requires many observations, even where the subject may be submitted to the anatomical knife, to optical glasses, to analysis by fire or by solvents. How much more than where it is a faculty, not a substance, we are examining, where it eludes the research of all the senses, where the conditions of its existence are various and variously combined, where the effects of those which are present or absent bid defiance to calculation, right? He says, let me add too, as a circumstance of great tenderness, where a conclusion would degrade a whole race of men from the rank of the scale of beings to which their creator may have given them, right? So he is cautioning that whatever he's saying about Black people is provisional. We haven't studied race, different species, different races long enough for there to be conclusions that are heavily supported by available evidence. People take this passage as Jefferson's shilly-shally, dilly-dallying. He says one thing and says another. No, he's just an empiricist.
Right.
If I say no penguins fly, then all of a sudden somehow I observe something that's biologically, genetically a penguin flying, my conclusion that no penguins flies needs to be discarded.
Yeah.
So that's the context. I mean, we'll talk about more specifically about the orangutan and so forth as we go on.
So he was willing to change his mind given further evidence.
Well, he's always an empiricist, and that's what you are as an empiricist. You have to, he's pronouncing that like Newton, Locke, Galileo. He's a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we are on this show. I mean, we make claims about Jefferson. I make claims about Jefferson not having had a relationship with Sally Hemings.
Right.
If something comes along that proves me wrong, I simply change my mind.
Right.
Right. So that's what it means to be an empiricist, to be honest about your research. Right.
I love it.
That's the way to do it. I keep feeling someone staring over my shoulder. I don't know what it is.
It's a wise man of the woods.
Sure, we're probably a lot wiser than you or I am. But anyway.
Okay. So most scholars say nothing about that strange sentence, yet some have reacted. What have they said?
Well, in my book on Jefferson, on race and on slavery in race, I refer to three people. Annette Gordon Reed, she says, Jefferson, Reed has a penchant for seeing and expressing things in the extreme. I disagree with that off the bat. He doesn't. She says, of a piece with all this was his habit of delving into books and finding and believing the sometimes outlandish stories told in them about things like the sexual preferences of orangutans in tropical jungles, an animal he knew nothing about from a place he never visited. Now, at first blush, that sounds like a very poignant objection, a remonstrance, but people were studying orangutans, chimpanzees, and apes for the first time, probably in the history of the world. They were studying all different types of species of plants and animals. And you're going to don't we delve into our books today?
Oh, for sure.
And then we believe what the authors are writing. It doesn't mean that our science might not change, centuries from now. But does that make it irrational to believe what the experts are saying today? Not in the least. Riz Isaac says, Jefferson talks about his lust for black females and his lust of black men for white women, just dismisses that. And finally, our buddy, Paul Finke, he says Jefferson's observations are empirically unsupportable. Well, we know that today. He says, this part I like, he says, the reverse was more likely the case, as he surely knew, that instead of black people, black women desiring white men, it's obviously white men desiring black women. Now, if you want to accuse Jefferson of throwing out an empirically unsupportable claim, what evidence does Finkelman have for arguing the opposite?
The only evidence and I think you may have mentioned this or somebody mentioned it, is that uh, the number of children that were born of slave women from their masters, their white masters, typically.
Yeah, but not very interesting because he's making a universal claim. He's making a claim that all white males, for example, are lusting after black females, which is
Right,
clearly false. Like the claim is all black females are lusting after white males is
right,
clearly false.
right.
I mean, it's a universal generalization, and Finkelman is coming back with the opposite generalization, which is really quite stupid
Yeah.
for an intelligent person. The fact that some white males lusted after blacks, fine, and some blacks lusted after whites is fine.
Mhm.
Don't universalize the claim. So that's what we have. For the most part, most scholars lay off this comment, probably because they find it really weird that Jefferson would make that claim. So I only talk about three different people and their objections to it. Gordon Reed's claim sounds pretty reasonable at first blush, but I think when you study it, no, it's not reasonable at all. Uh, anyways.
Okay. Um, uh, Thomas Jefferson clearly was not appealing to any observations that he might have had. Where then did he get the notion that black women prefer white men and that male orangutans prefer black women? Prima
Well,
facie, a preposterous claim.
yeah, again, it's preposterous when you go from the advantage of present day knowledge and science.
Right.
Right? But everybody was talking about again, we talked about this prior going in there. This is the first time in the history of the world that people were seriously studying. You didn't have to study so much. Aristotle studied everything. He was observing, but he came up with a very static picture of how the world worked. It wasn't any change or evolution. And this is a time where Aristotle's picture of the universe is falling apart. We've seen fossils and studying fossils for the first time and realized that certain species of plants and animals no longer exist. That's happening in Jefferson's day. We need to come up with a different way of looking at the world. And we're studying animals. This is the first time in the history of the world we have a telescope. Galileo makes his own telescope. He observes that Jupiter has moons, Saturn has, he calls ears because the telescope had poor collimation. It wasn't very clear. And, sunspots. Aristotle said sun can't have spots because it's a perfect body.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're just coming at it. We're in a sort of intellectual, scientific, philosophical crisis in Jefferson's day, just prior to Jefferson's day. But what they thought, they're still using Aristotle's teleology, that everything is striving for its own end, for its own sake, right? And for Descartes, humans are essentially rational beings, strive to be following Aristotle and Plato. We're thinking things. So what we get is, people are starting to realize that simians, that primates are very similar to human beings in appearance, in mannerisms, and so forth. We know chimpanzees actually have wars among themselves at times. And so it's a very exciting and interesting time. And they bought into something called the Scala Naturae in Latin, this great chain of being. Now, the Encyclopedia Britannica talks about it. And the chain of being goes back all the way to Aristotle. I read a passage from book 1.8 of his Politics, where Aristotle literally talks about all the different sorts of species of things that exist. and everyone at a lower level striving is in existence for something at the higher level, i.e., plants. He says plants exist for the sake of animals and the other animals, right? Domestic species, both for his service and his food, for the good of man. So, in other words, animals, some are domesticated because they serve human beings. So, all other species of animals, and Aristotle thinks man is an animal, calls it a zoon in Greek.
Mhm.
We get zoology as animal. And we're irrational animals, but because we're rational animals, all the other ones in some sense are subordinate to us and can be used in our purpose. Now, the Encyclopedia Britannica talks of this notion of the scale of nature that we have. I'll go all the way down to Linnaeus, who in 1758, the 10th version of his Systema Naturae, system of nature, divides everything into minerals, plants, and animals. And the idea is that from all the way from minerals to plants, there is a sort of ladder where from one mineral to another, certain minerals are so imperceptibly linked close together that we can't even, there's a chain, but the links are so tightly wound, it's hard to say. And, we're looking at animals, and we have the vermin, the insects, the fish, the amphibians, ones that exist in land and water, the birds and the mammals. And then at the top of that, among the mammals, we have humans. And all of these are in a scale from lower animals to higher animals. And there is a link between them. We're looking at fossils. So Leibniz says, and I'll read a passage from Leibniz, all the different classes of beings which taken together make up the universe are in the ideas of God, who knows distinctly their essential gradations, only so many ordinates of a single curve so closely united. Is he talking about the calculus here? And
Mhm.
moving asymptoticity. Only so many ordinates of a single curve so closely united that it would be impossible to place others between any two of them, since that would imply disorder and imperfection. Men are linked with the animals, these with the plants, and these with the fossils, which in turn merge with those bodies which our senses and our imagination represent to us as absolutely inanimate. So we get from inanimate to fossils, which are sort of animate and inanimate. Then we get to plants and animals. And since the law of continuity requires that when the essential attributes of one being approximate those of another, all the properties of the one must likewise gradually approximate those of the other. It is necessary that all the orders of natural beings form but a single chain in which the various classes, like so many rings, are so closely linked to one another that it is impossible for the senses or the imagination to determine precisely the point at which one ends and the next begins. So you have the scale from inanimate all the way to human being. Descartes, and there's between orangutans and humans. Humans were thought by Linnaeus to be, orangutans were thought to be humans of a sort of barbaric sort. And everything at the lower rung of the ladder is striving for the next level, or so the argument goes. So the notion of orangutan striving after black women. Blacks were thought inferior by most of the people at the time, but the orangutans wanted to propagate with blacks with whites, and so forth. So the argument goes, that's the way they thought at the time. I'll give you one other example is Descartes. Descartes, in his meditations, argues God is pure perfection. He gives this argument clever, but uncogent. He says everybody has a notion of God
Mhm.
as a perfect being. He says we have this clear and distinct idea of this notion of a purely perfect being without any flaws. Now, right off the bat, and he says the notion of it is clear and distinct. Now, does this notion we have exist? Well, if it's purely perfect, it has to exist because existence is a perfection. And if it's purely perfect, it has to have existence. Now, he's really defining God into existence. One way to get out of the argument is to say that I don't have this notion of, and I think I don't, this perfect being without flaws. I certainly can't conceive it. Maybe I can understand it. I'm not sure I can.
Actually, since you're not a perfect being, and neither am I,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be impossible for us to actually perceive this perfect being?
Well,
Can
he
I, as
thinks we can
a
have.
being,
He thinks we can have an understanding of it, right? I mean, let's look at it this way.
approximation at best?
Yeah, I just think we can't understand it. We can understand what it means for something not to have flaws, right? Because we understand what a flaw is, and whatever that being is, it doesn't have these things. But that
Right.
doesn't mean we can understand. We certainly can't conceive it. Can you picture in your head a 20-sided figure where each of the sides is exactly the same length? Can you picture it in your head perfectly,
Not
clearly?
perfectly.
No. I mean,
I
I could
could,
do that with a square,
right.
but a 100-sided figure, I can't do,
Yeah, right.
and so forth. But I think you get
But
it.
we
But
can do
anyways,
here, which
but
you,
he thinks between God, which is pure perfection, and nothing. Blaise Pascal says the same thing. There are all sorts of beings that are inanimate objects, all the way to plants and animals. Then we get to God, and each has a level of greater perfection till we get to God, it's all perfect. So we go
sure.
something has nothing, has no perfection, all the way to God, which is the greatest thing, which is pure perfection. So Descartes gives you that sort of argument. And that's the way they thought at the time. Um, to go into Voltaire, his Candide, Professor Pangloss, who's arguing against Leibniz, is le meilleur de mon possible. Candide um, with Cacambo, they're out and they see two monkeys chasing two um, barbaric women in the jungle. The women are running around naked. The monkeys are chasing after them and biting their butt cheeks. And Candide says, well, I learned how to shoot my gun. So he goes and bam, bam, he shoots away and kills the monkeys. The women turn around and they start crying. And Cacambo says, you've performed a wonderful masterpiece. You have killed the two lovers of these young ladies. And Candide says, they're lovers. Can it be possible? I hate when people translate, can it be possible? Can implies possibility. So just that, can it be? That can be possible. You're jesting at me, Cacambo. How can I believe you? And he says, my dear master, you are always surprised by everything. Why should you think it's so strange that in some countries there should be monkeys who obtain ladies' favors? They are quarter men, as I am a quarter Spaniard, right? And at the frontispiece of, I don't know if this could come on. Let's see if it comes on here. Yeah, we'll get it the right length.
Put it in front of your face.
Yeah, there we go. Notice we have the two naked women in the frontispiece and the two dead monkeys, right?
Yeah.
And so forth. Um, and so, I mean, we have, so Voltaire is sort of lampooning this, but he's following the science of his day, right? That, why should it be so strange? Monkeys are quarter human being, just like I'm quarter Spaniard.
Hmm.
And, you follow that, and Voltaire is following the science of his day, and it's pretty interesting. But people were talking of this. And when on a paper I wrote that accompanies this, I'll send for publication, the front, I have a picture that was on Linnaeus's System Natura, the 10th, where you had a orangutan in a tree holding a native black woman, a naked woman, and then the black man with a bow and arrow trying to shoot the orangutan, get his woman back. But the idea was, and Lord Monboddo at the time expressed this. Let me go back to that. He says, whose name is James Burnett, Lord Monboddo. Um, he talked about the orangutan, is altogether man, both outside and inside, excepting some small variations, such as cannot make a specific difference between the two animals, and I am persuaded are less considerable than are to be found betwixt individuals that are undoubtedly of the human species. So he's talking about the orangutan being man. It really is a man. It's distinct from other primates like chimpanzees, monkeys, gorillas, apes, and so forth. It's more man than it is those. Orangutan literally means wild man, right? They said someone who resembles apes more than resembles man more than apes or baboons. Um, let's see. He says he talks of episodes where they like women and frequently carry away young girls, young tribal girls. That could be from Amazon tribes or African tribes. Skin color is not necessarily an issue here. Um, he talked about chimpanzees. He says, but they're 7 feet tall. They carry away young Negro girls and keep them for their pleasure, right? Um, so the
So
idea, go ahead.
in that passage where they say they're 7 feet tall, so I understand that orangutan doesn't imply the orangutans from Borneo and Sumatra. These are um, primates on the African continent,
For
uh,
him, yeah.
including chimpanzees, and the 7 foot tall ones would be gorillas.
I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked
I,
into it
I
that
don't know of a
deeply, but
7 foot tall chimpanzee.
yeah,
I think
there is no 17. So might be talking about gorillas, or he might be talking, I don't know how tall orangutans are. It might be talking about orangutans.
they're about our height, maybe a little shorter, but
Yeah.
um, the peoples of Indonesia or the Sumatra, Borneo, they're yellow skinned and not dark in color. So to me, I think they're using the word orangutan to imply only the African chimpanzee and gorilla.
I don't
That's
know. I mean,
yeah, I don't know either.
the point is I haven't gone into what, with great. The one point is that you have, if you're going to make fun of Jefferson, you have to do your research. You have to go into
Oh,
the
for
biology
sure.
of the day.
Yeah,
And I've done that a little bit.
yeah.
And am I going to write a book on this? No, I'm just not that interested. But the point is, he's drawing from the naturalists, the early biologists, anthropologists, which wasn't a term back then, but of his day.
Hmm.
Were they wrong? Well, yeah, probably. But where does he get these observations of chimpanzees or orangutans carrying away native black women? He probably heard it from somebody. Did it ever occur? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe it did. But it probably certainly wasn't something that happened typically, if it did happen. And maybe it was just created because if we're talking about orangutans being more human than ape-like, you know, we're going to create stories like this
Right,
that are
right.
consistent with it being a human,
Yeah.
consistent with the ladder of being. The orangutan is above apes and chimpanzees, and it's a human of sorts. So it's going to strive to the next level of humans, namely blacks, and want to have intercourse with them, and blacks would want to have intercourse with other types of human beings. Now, are these observations slanted at the time? We know today, yes, but at the time, we didn't know. So if we're going to accuse not Aristotle, Jefferson of being ignorant of what we know today, that's fine. But why should he have our understanding today of what was going on back then?
Which leads us, I believe, into our next question here. Let's revisit Gordon Reed's remonstrance of a piece with all of this was his habit of delving into books and finding and believing the sometimes outlandish stories told in them about things like the sexual preferences of orangutans in tropical jungles, an animal he knew nothing about from a place he never visited. Cannot Thomas Jefferson be accused of credulousness? Why was he so eager to believe such a preposterous claim? Because
Again, Gordon Reed's point has weight if you understand it from the present perspective. The science was new at the time. Now, Aristotle,
but even then, you remarked back in the past, we made up stories about chimpanzees, possibly. And you also even allude to the possibility that this didn't really ever, it happened maybe once or twice, but it wasn't a commonplace thing for chimpanzees or gorillas carrying off women into the forests. So Thomas Jefferson, being as well read and as critical a thinker as he was, wouldn't he take one or two examples that might seem, even for his time, unless he really bought into the scala natura, and he believed in this uh, infinitesimal gradation from mineral to God, and that he wouldn't question it, right? Is
I
that
think I
really
think he
where?
believed in it, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think Voltaire's writing about it, and a lot of people. I mean, it's the piece has, like I said, it his scale in Linnaeus's book, the 10th version has an orangutan with a black woman up a tree, and the black man's trying to shoot an arrow to kill the orangutan. So these are the foremost scientists of the day talking about it. Why wouldn't you believe it?
Well, I might believe some of the more objective uh, characterizations. Um, yeah, sure, somebody's shooting an orangutan in a tree, but I might not believe that that orangutan, chimpanzee, gorilla was necessarily human. And even if I did, I wouldn't. Why would I believe that they were? I guess because human males will oftentimes take women off. So if chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans are humans, then I would be forced to draw the conclusion that in some instances they might carry off other humans, including uh, humans, Homo sapiens, off. So I guess they didn't know have the word Homo.
Well, if you buy into scale of nature, and if everything at the lower level is striving to be at the next level, and the next
Right,
level is so darn similar to you,
right,
these are the sort of stories that people would be telling.
yeah,
It's consistent with the theory. Now, the theory is flawed. The theory you know today is
right,
wrong. We're evolutionary biologists today. At least I hope we are. So the theory has been replaced, but at the time, these stories were consistent. There's no reason to doubt that. I would not have doubted them, um, given the science that we had at the
right.
time, which was flawed. But
And
you
I
know
guess
that
one of the things,
I go back to Aristotle. Aristotle thought, for example, Greeks were naturally superior to all human beings everywhere, and the Greeks had a right through war, whatever, to enslave any other type of human being.
mhm,
Where do we get the word Mediterranean Sea? Middle Earth,
Middle Earth,
Mediterranean. I mean, the Mediterranean thought that was really where all the action was happening. And if you're Greek, why wouldn't you think you're superior? Archimedes, Aristotle, Plato, Herodotus, Thucydides, and the great generals. We know, watching YouTube videos right now, that they had chemical warfare. They had ships, battleships like we had today. They actually could fire plumes of fire, from ships. They were incredibly sophisticated. They gave us geometry, Euclid, and sorts of things. It's incredibly intelligent, sophisticated people. If you travel to Greece today, and I've been there a number of times, 5 times, I think, you would wonder, well, what happened to this Greek intelligence? I'm not making fun of Greeks, but living at the time, if you were in Greece, this was a climate that was highly inhospitable to intelligence because of the aridity, the dryness, the bad
mm,
soil. Um, anyway, so I think we can I would dispense with Gordon Reed's argument by just saying, look, it's highly presentist. And, to buy into the science of the day doesn't make you a fool. It's rational until some alterations come and can show you that you ought to change your mind. Anyways, what do we have? I mean, you like that? I don't know how much time. I think we're low.
yeah, I liked it. It
I
was
mean,
um,
what do we have for next week?
so next week we have a special treat. Lawyer William Highland, author of In Defense of Thomas Jefferson, will join us and give his critical thoughts on the recent series on Thomas Jefferson from the History Channel. There's a new 6-part series. Is that right? I think it's six
Yeah,
parts.
we have access. You and I have access to to only the first two parts.
Right.
And William Highland, who has written a book, Defense of Thomas Jefferson, really good book, by the way. When I just got into Jefferson scholarships, one of the first books I read. Maybe he'll talk about it a little bit, but about 3 minutes left. But it's really does a good job of showing if you brought Jefferson's paternity case into court, that it'd be thrown out. Perfectly cogent. Now, that doesn't prove that Jefferson, for example, did not have an affair with
Right.
someone. It just shows you if you tried to, with the evidence available, with the paucity of evidence, it wouldn't be thrown out of court.
That's what I was thinking, and I don't know, a few years ago when you first started talking about this stuff, is you're innocent until proven guilty. And this guy's Thomas Jefferson's not guilty with beyond a reasonable doubt.
So William will talk next week on the accusations of Jefferson's racism. We have a pretty stacked deck there, and with Peter Onuf and Ned Gordon Reed, Paul Finkelman, right? We talked about Finkelman's love of Jefferson. I say jokingly, hates Jefferson. So when you bring a cast of characters in there, you're going to get a stacked deck. And so William Highland will help us walk us through that. He's going to provide us some comments on. You and I will have something to say about the general overall structure and the characters, and William will come in and talk about his critique of that. All right, I think we're about done here, right?
Yep.
TTFN, and say goodbye to my stranger there. I just felt like I had eyes on me the whole time. We'll do it again next week. See you. Thank you for joining us.
Cool.
Take care.